Good afternoon, everybody. Well, it's a real delight to see you all here for this very special occasion. I will be brief and introduce our panel. Patty Cronin, a feminist artist, that's my description of her, whose work explores questions of identity, gender equity, and violence against women, asks, what is the role of contemporary art in our 24-hour news cycle society? What can an artist do if they're not a politician, a policymaker, or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? Hopefully, the artist looks out, keenly observes the world, reflects and responds in a way that shakes us out of our numbness. We cannot be silent. In preparation for and in response to the exhibition of Ai Weiwei here at Palazzo Strozzi, we organized NYU Florence's Mapping Contemporary Florence series around an inquiry into art engaged in publics and public questions, for which we have always used the shorthand mapping as socially engaged art practice. But this is not the first time we've explored this practice at NYU Florence. In 2007, I organized a symposium on public art at Villa La Pietra with Lynn Gumpert from the Gray Art Gallery in New York and Creative Time. This was the first time we met PATO, who participated in that symposium. During that conference, a very distinguished group of artists, art historians, and theorists, other art professionals, and community activists explored a variety of questions, the first of which was, does the term public art simply signify art in a public setting, or art that consciously engages with the public? What does it mean to engage the public today? What is the role of an artist in social engagement? And to which traditional academic disciplines do we refer for research in this subject? How does the practice relate to, for instance, art history, to politics, or to sociology? Is it even necessary to define or delimit the practice? That symposium was followed by a series of meetings in New York, which PATO participated in, and then a smaller meeting over the weekend at the end of November 2012, back here in Florence, organized with PATO, during which we created our limited task to begin to craft a definition or a description of socially engaged art practice, not to limit it or to confine it, but to create a vocabulary or a shorthand with which to discuss the practice outside of the realm of artists and social activists who are involved, if for nothing else but to set up a center here in the site and to raise money for it. That definition, and this is the last thing I'll read to you except bios, is artists working in the field of social practice focus on aesthetics, ethics, collaboration, media strategies, and social activism as central issues in forming their artwork and projects, which are designed for public and social spaces. How does art operate in and as the public? What is the public in the 21st century? What kind of change can the cultural sphere enact? So I set out this background and these questions and definitions in order to give a broad framework for these talks and a set of concerns which you might think about when you are looking at the exhibition this evening, not just on this visit, but hopefully when you return to make future visits on your own. Well, one more thing I should announce that PATO and HENTYLE are doing a workshop after tonight's tour of the exhibition in order to somewhat respond to that exhibition. PATO will tell you more about it, but there are 2 meetings tomorrow for that if you're interested in joining the workshop. So, our speakers tonight. Arturo Galansino, who will speak first, is the director of Palazzo Strozzi and the curator of the exhibition Ai Weiwei, Libero. Before being appointed director of Palazzo Strozzi, he has served as curator of exhibitions at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, curatorial assistant at the National Gallery in London, and assistant curator at the Louvre Museum in Paris. He completed his BA and MA in art history at the University of Milan and his PhD in art history and criticism at the University of Turin. HENTYLE YAPP has just joined NYU's Tisch School of the Arts in the Department of Art and Public Policy. He previously taught at Pomona College and San Francisco State University. His research broadly engages the theoretical and methodological implications of queer, disability, and critical race studies for questions regarding the state. He received his BA from Brown University in French literature, a JD from UCLA Law School with specializations in critical race theory and public interest law, and a PhD from UC Berkeley in performance studies with an emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality. His current book project examines a site commonly overdetermined by state discourse, China. By attending to cross-media art practices and global art market, YAPP traces how contemporary China circulates in transnational discourse to produce more nuanced understandings of the role of the state. He danced professionally for experimental and contemporary companies in New York and Taipei, and continues to choreograph for companies in other art spaces. What don't you do? It's a lot of careers you've had. PATO HEBERT, who will be facilitating the conversation this evening, and I'm sorry to repeat the bios that you already have in hand, but we are recording this, and for purposes of the recording, it's necessary. PATO is a visual artist, educator, and cultural worker. He splits his time between New York and his creative studio in Los Angeles. Born in Idaho Falls, Idaho, Hebert spent his childhood there and in Eugene, Oregon. He also lived in Panama, where his mother is from. He joined the Art and Public Policy Department at NYU in 2012. Prior to NYU, he was a visiting assistant professor at Reed College and Scripps College. He also taught at the Arts Center College of Design and the University of California, Irvine. Hebert's artwork explores the challenges and possibilities of interconnectedness. He is particularly interested in space and place, spirituality and ecology, pedagogy, and progressive praxis. He works with photography, graphic design, sculpture, installation, light, text, performance, and socially engaged forms. His work appears in museums and gallery settings, as well as community spaces, schools, public architecture, and unexpected nodes of circulation. He often works in collaborations with fellow artists, writers, educators, young people, community members, and stakeholders. He currently works with the Global Forum on MSM and HIV to help organizations strengthen civil society and push governments to better meet the health needs and human rights of LGBT people. Hebert earned his MFA in Studio Arts from the University of California, Irvine, and his BA in Studio Arts from Stanford University. So I'm thrilled to welcome you all. I'm very grateful for you having accepted our invitation, and I look forward to a really enlightening evening. Thank you. Arturo.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for being here tonight. It's great to be in front of such a international and young crowd. Is exactly the public we are looking for, and the idea of hosting a Ai Weiwei show in Palazzo Strozzi, it was also going this direction, to be more part of the new generation, to be more part of what are the new trends in culture. We are a little bit tired now after so many days of opening talks and talks and talks. So it will be very short. And I think it's the most important thing is that afterwards you are going to enjoy our show. It's a very classic show at the end. It's a retrospective, a complete retrospective of 30 years of career of one of the major figures, not only artists of our times. Ai Weiwei is a visual artist, but is probably even more famous for being an activist, fighting for human and civil rights. As you know, he's an ambassador of Amnesty International, and in this sense is one of the leaders, the protagonist of these last years. As you know, he had problems with the Chinese regime, and he made, in a way, of this problem one of the leading part of his poetic, of his narrative. As I told you, it's the end of a long journey because we started this exhibition, we started working on this exhibition almost 2 years ago. At the time, I was still in London working at the Royal Academy. We were preparing the first major European retrospective on the artist. And the artist was still in China, and he was not allowed to travel. 1 year afterwards, we are about July 2015, the artist received his passport back. This is an important moment if we have to consider historically the figure of Ai Weiwei. And this is also the reason of the title, Libero, free. He has been Libero for 1 year already, and the career of the artist slightly changed already. His new research of Ai Weiwei is not only looking and researching in China, inside the borders of this country, but also outside the border of China. And that's very clear. The new works of Ai Weiwei included the installation reframe in on our facade is, of course, thinking about something different from China. The migration theme is the new theme of the research of Ai Weiwei, and this is the starting point of our exhibition. Everybody could admire it or not on the facade of Palazzo Strozzi. It's an important moment for us because Palazzo Strozzi is shifting to a new dimension. We are, for the first time, we are hosting a major contemporary art show. It's the biggest Ai Weiwei show ever. I recently discovered it, I didn't know it. And for the first time, we are using the building in a new way. You will see after the visitor could enjoy the exhibition on all the level of the palace. Of course, from outside, the facade, inside, the courtyard, downstairs, the basement, and upstairs, the major floor, the so-called piano nobile. So it's a really big show, and it's very complete. And so in this way, this exhibition gave us the opportunity to rediscover the building itself, because we clear up all the space from the temporary structure that normally we use to have exhibition. You know, on the 15th century walls, you can hang any painting. So normally our palace is covered, hidden behind these fake walls. Now, also the palace is free. So the title is also alludes to the free way that the artists use to interpret our building and also our culture, because as you know, Ai Weiwei is also an architect, and there is a lot of architectural thinking behind this display. You will see it, and I hope you will agree with me. So for us, is a perfect example, a perfect operation to make Florence again a city able to create contemporary culture, and not only a keeper of its important past, and to make Palazzo Strozzi a leader in a leader institution in displaying contemporary art for a wider public. You know, contemporary art is another important issue in Italy because we don't have a major contemporary art institution, we don't do major contemporary art exhibitions, and normally the public is very little. Also, if we think about the Biennale of Venice, probably one of the most important contemporary event in the world, the numbers are not so great. So I think that Palazzo Strozzi, with this exhibition and with the future exhibition, is going to play an important role in our national culture. I am curator and director of the institution, so it's a very peculiar situation. Now I have spoken as a director, and maybe later in conversation I will play the curator. Thank you very much.
Okay, good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good. I just flew in from New York, so I feel like you all should have a little bit more energy. So how is everybody today? Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's really, really wonderful. What I'm gonna do today is just sort of give a general primer on Ai Weiwei's work. So just sort of a quick run through, and you'll be going through the show today. So I won't sort of go through too much of that, because a lot of this information is sort of out there and some things that you'll sort of get through. But my main focus today is to give some context, both in terms of Ai Weiwei's work, but also in relationship to modern China. And then to think about mainly the sort of predicament of how exactly are we sort of look at his work beyond context, beyond history, and really trying to think about how we engage non-Western art and the sort of narratives that we inscribe in relationship to the non-West. So as sort of described, I won't go through this too much, Ai Weiwei works in a ton of different media. So as sort of mentioned briefly, he is an architect, so this is in Chaochangdi, which is his main art complex in Beijing. And he also most notably worked as, with the architectural team to build the National Stadium for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. In terms of visual art, he's been quite influential and quite known. So these are some urn series that you'll be looking at a bit. Sort of, it's possibly, it hasn't been verified in terms of the types of urns that have been used, but theoretically could have been sort of ancient objects that he's painted on and dropped. And then the pieces, this is what he calls study of perspective, the good flick off onto key monuments. He's also been quite known, especially for contemporary Chinese art, as a curator, and he most notably co-curated a show, Fuck Off, in Shanghai with Feng Boyi, which is one of the most influential shows in terms of the sort of formation of contemporary Chinese art and discourses around it, particularly around censorship. Next, and most importantly, these are sort of details that I'll look at a bit more today and unpack a bit. But most notably, he's been known as a documentarian and quite active on social media. This is an image from one of his films. And he's also been quite sort of broadly circulating in relationship to installation art. So Sunflowers was a key work in 2010 at Tate Modern. So all of these are hand-painted ceramic mimics of sunflower seeds. So he hired many different artisans from Jingzhezhen, China, to hand paint each and every single sunflower seed that was then put into the turbine hall at the Tate, where people would run around, and eventually, in true sort of ironic fashion, and especially in relationship to China, around discourses of contagion. This is following after SARS as a discourse. It was seen that perhaps running through these hand-painted ceramic sunflower seeds would be slightly toxic. So that was eventually forbidden. So it's sort of an interesting narrative that also goes along with how China is often discussed as what people say is the sick man of Asia. The piece that I write a lot about is a piece that he presented at Documenta in 2007 called Fairy Tale. And so it was a multimedial piece. So the first here is a sculpture that was initially erected from discarded doors and other materials from construction, so sort of the rapid construction happening in Beijing and across China, where he built this sort of the negative space in the middle was a large temple. And eventually what you're seeing here toppled down after a storm. He also placed 1,001 chairs, empty chairs, throughout the space in Documenta. And most notably, in terms of being a multimedial sort of artist, he brought over 1,001 Chinese people into the space Documenta. So this is a picture, he brought them in two different waves. So this is the first sort of family photo. I always joke that this oddly looks like a photo of my own family. As we hurl around and everybody, you always need that family photo. And during that time, as he brought over these Chinese citizens over, there's a whole documentary on this as well. They stayed in these sort of constructed sites and also were given 1,001 pieces of luggage. And this white material is a sort of Velcro material. So in all of these sort of works that you'll kind of see, especially with sunflower seeds and with fairy tale, there's a lot of repetition. And there's a lot of use of objects used over and over. And so that was kind of a starting place for me to think about how to write about Ai Weiwei and how to think about his work, particularly around this idea of repetition and mass. So it's just something to highlight and note that I'll get into in a minute. So next, I really kind of just want to walk through a bit of Ai Weiwei's biography, because I think that's sort of a critical anchor that many people use to sort of describe his work. And what I'm going to do, I was joking on the taxi ride over that I'm being the worst teacher possible because I'm going to run through all of modern Chinese history in about 2 minutes. This is the improper Cliff's Notes version, but it's just to give you a sense as to where he's situated, but most importantly, the way he's situated in relationship to this history, and then to ask how to think beyond this sort of deep historicization. So he was born in 1957, which is a crucial date, in particular to the formation of modern China. And so what we see in terms of what people mark as modern China is really a sort of, for lack of better words right now, a battle between the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, the KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party. And so this is the Cliff's Notes version. So the communists win, Mao Zedong takes power. It's really not that simple, but alas, today it will be that simple, which is really around the end of World War II. And so for those of you who are interested in Taiwan-China relations, this is the Kuomintang, the KMT party that then moves to Taiwan. And there's a whole fractured history there. But most importantly, during this moment, the key real question to then ask is, how do you unify all of this? How do you unify this huge landmass in terms of the Communist Party, considering the fact that it's so geographically sparse, class-based, it's extremely sparse, and on top of that, there's many different dialects being spoken. So there's a lot of critical questions around how do you unify masses of people. So this is sort of to mark this idea of masses and a repetition. And so much of this, there's a ton of research, and if you're interested in it, more than willing, I'm a total loser, and I read on Chinese modern history all the time, so if you like to talk about it, I'm around the next few days. But what's most important to sort of think about is how do you unify people? This is a huge project. This is really a project of surrounding technology, as radio is being used to sort of promote propaganda and other discourses. So this is a really key, important moment. So following the Great Leap Forward and the Communist Party really taking hold, what we see is what's known as the Cultural Revolution from 66 to 76, which is really a sort of a massive displacement of families into re-education camps. So one of the goals of the Communist Party was to essentially get people to either let go of what they viewed as sort of old feudal ways in China, but also sort of newer bourgeois ways of the West. And what they were trying to do is figure out a Chinese communist way. And the Cultural Revolution, again, this deserves years and years of lectures, but I will just say it's a really complex historical moment. So Ai Weiwei is quite situated in this in the sense that his father, Ai Qing, was a really famous poet and was seen as sort of too bourgeois and was sent to re-education camps in '58 and then to Xinjiang in a much more rural, sort of removed region in '61. What's sort of important to mark is the way that Ai Weiwei is sort of fit into this moment of Chinese history of being actually raised within the Cultural Revolution, which is why many people sort of talk deeply about that tie. And they returned to Beijing in '76 after the end of the Cultural Revolution, after Mao's death. He's then enrolls in the Beijing Film Academy in '78, and then during this time he is sort of a big sort of founding member of what's known as the STARS group. So there's a whole sort of avant-garde art movement happening at this time. While at the same time you have folks like Robert Rauschenberg and other Western European and US artists coming into China. So there's this very sort of transnational moment that he's part of and infiltrated in. Then he moves to New York in '81 from 1981 to '93. So it's sort of very deep in the New York downtown scene in many different medium. And I think what's also really important to note is him coming in at a moment where the HIV crisis is happening, where what's known as the culture wars is also taking place. There's a lot of discourse around difference within sort of the United States context. In '93, he returns to Beijing and becomes quite central in setting up what's now known as the East Village. It was a place where nobody wanted to live, and now it's almost like a contemporary art Disneyland if you ever visit. And so he was quite pivotal in helping build that scene amongst other members, in addition to the sort of curatorial work that he was doing. So he's, as sort of noted, he sort of gained a lot of notoriety, first being sort of a big representative of what's often called soft diplomacy by the Chinese state, working heavily with China to sort of produce the spectacle known as the 2008 Olympics, in particular the opening ceremony. But right after and I think this is a moment to sort of mark his political work. Right after the Olympics, there was a huge earthquake in Sichuan. primarily due to the lack of sort of well-built buildings. And so what he did was try to figure out who died and to start making this a very public entity to sort of critique the Chinese state. So he publishes the names of all of 5,853 names that he could find of these children. So these two are images from that. And again, to sort of note the use of repetition, the use of the same object over and over, which again, in relationship to reframe in the opening, it's the same object. So this is something to sort of mark that I've been obsessed with trying to sort of unpack and untie. So these are, the rebar are all the bars that were taken from the construction, the sort of shabby buildings that were broken down. They were straightened out and then displayed. The back are all the names written down. And then he also has these different pieces where he sews together children's backpacks and creates these sort of large formations, so the use of repetition. So he's been quite active in relationship to the earthquake. He's also has had a really active blog. MIT Press has a great compilation of it if you're interested in that. He is still on Twitter. I don't use Twitter or anything, so I'm not in that vein, but I'm sure many of you do. And then as noted earlier, much of this has then to do with his house arrest and then his recent ability to travel again. I want to offer these sort of contexts to then start asking, how do we then begin to perhaps think beyond this context? How do we then create a way to move out of these sort of narratives around Ai Weiwei? So what I mean by that is oftentimes Ai Weiwei is discussed in what I notice, and especially in terms of art reviews and public discourse, is sort of three sort of main frameworks. So the first is that he's a dissident artist. The second is that he's emblematic of the Cultural Revolution. So to bring us back to that history, they'll often talk about artists who were adults in the Cultural Revolution, and he fits into the category of children during the Cultural Revolution, and then the third are those born after the Cultural Revolution. So it's become a big curatorial frame. It's been a big way to sort of talk about artists and fitting them within these moments in history. The other way that I think we need that people talk about him is great politics, bad art. So that's also another way that's a framework of talking about him. So some of the problems with some of these frameworks are the following. So when you talk about solely an artist being sort of wedded to a particular historical context, what this often does, it sort of psychologizes them. It makes them really quite static, and it places them via generations, and it doesn't really attend to some of their unique qualities around form, some of their exploration of what I'm noting of repetition with Ai Weiwei. It essentially negates many of these sort of formalist and interesting innovations that come up with their work in order to place them via a very clean narrative. And I think this is also something that I read about, which is this is a condition that often is situated around non-Western artists and also minoritarian artists working within the United States. So it's thinking through this sort of predicament. The type of discourse around good politics, and as somebody who writes about Ai Weiwei and other, or about contemporary artists in general, I always ask, like, what do you think? And that's one of those moments where I won't say it publicly, but there's some works I don't like, some works I do of his. There's some works I don't like of other artists and not. But I actually try to sort of stop myself from making an aesthetic judgment and trying to figure out what they're doing. Figure out what their obsessions are, what their knots are, what they care about. And I feel that for me, as not having to work directly in the art world and working more as an academic, that it's trying to allow space to figure out, what do you care about? And then to allow that to then open up new avenues to think about the artwork. The last sort of critical frame, the issue with the sort of dissidence resistance frame, is that it often tries to create this narrative of critiquing China, which really posits and places China as this sort of pre-modern entity in relationship to the West as being completely modern, the fully democratic. As we know, in today's sort of political landscape, especially in the United States, there's a lot of issues. So one way of trying to get us out of this type of narrative, of this sort of progress, regress narrative, is to try to rethink how we restructure and replace many of these non-Western artists to sort of benefit these, what we call American exceptionalist narratives. So the methods that I'm trying to think about then is trying to think about this art beyond these overdetermined narratives of context, and to really, for me, this sort of question around how do I deal with this sort of formal relationship to repetition, which has a deep history with modern and contemporary art, and then what exists beyond and besides these sort of contexts, which I often write about in relationship to thinking about the limits of disciplines and methods. So obviously, Ai Weiwei's work hails many disciplines. As students, you will study many different things. And what's interesting is oftentimes we posit and sort of place ourselves in sort of limited disciplinary frameworks. And what's important is to kind of mark what other possibilities are there. So obviously there's art history, aesthetic theory. There's also Asian American studies, ethnic studies, queer studies, which is thinking a lot about the transnational. But there's also opposed and also different from the transnational is thinking about area studies, in particular with Asian and China studies. So there's all these different fields that he hails, but yet in terms of the academy, we don't train people to think and draw from these different fields. So that's one sort of way that I'm trying to think about him. So to be more concrete of that, and I'll end with this, is sort of with some different provocations, which is looking sort of at this piece of fairy tales. So one thing that's really important is that context is important. To sort of go through that history of the Cultural Revolution of modern China is critical work to do and necessary to have that background information. But the other thing to think about is there's something that he's doing with repetition, and when he brings all these bodies in, I'm actually quite interested in thinking about how the ways in which, especially the Chinese, and this sort of framework of that they all look the same, right? It's this very racist conception in which all the Asians look the same, right? This is something that's been said to me. All the time whenever there's another Asian or Asian American colleagues, I get called their name. You know, it's sort of the trope in which that operates. I don't think he's simply rejecting that, but he's actually sort of proposing something, a way to read about this sort of racialized condition of all looking the same, and I think some really nuanced ways. So I won't go too much into it, but that's something to think through, which is why queer studies is actually a very important framework for my work, but also the way that I understand them, which is how do you take something that's so abject and so negative and so difficult, and this is also from feminist theory as well, how do you actually find some possibility in that? How do I simply not say, oh, we don't all look the same, we're all human? Yes, but is there a way to think about that condition of being racialized in a certain way, to be masked, to be plural, to be situated in a certain way? What I want to sort of mark is that Ai Weiwei is in invoking this sort of very racialized conception of all looking the same. I think he's trying to produce certain forms of relationality to other communities who have been similarly placed in a subhuman category. Meaning his work is turning to many different other communities. So he has this really beautiful collaboration with a Navajo artist, Ben Benali, called Pole of the Moon. The bottom is Ai Weiwei's contribution. He uses a lot of bikes, again, the repetition, and this is a piece from Ben Benali. And what I'm trying to sort of mark is the way that he's trying to create these relationships to other forms of dispossession that aren't just simply about China, but really trying to find relationships to really unpack this idea of a subhuman, of being placed in a subhuman category, of not having a full humanity. So then with the refugee crisis, with Reframe, I think it's then a moment to reflect upon that sort of, that moment. So there's many different ways that we could read this. It's too Western, perhaps, or not Chinese enough. So it's a sort of call for context. It's too political and not artistic enough, so this sort of bad art, good politics framework. She's showing a certain form of resistance, which is, again, this Western desire to narrativize non-Western artists as always resistant. Or perhaps it's a naive multiculturalism or simplistic humanism. So what I think here is that Ai Weiwei offers us an avenue to really think about context, along with some of these open ways of thinking about relationality and plurality, which is sort of this place of thinking around in between disciplines. So some of the terms there are these turns to the multitude, and so this is thinking about political theory, Hart and Agree, and others, and also Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, who write about the undercommons. So I'm just throwing these names out there if these are places you want to sort of swim and think about more. But this is sort of a way that I'm trying to unpack and try to think through and beyond some of the dominant ways that Ai Weiwei has been situated and talked about. All right, thank you. Have a good day.
Two great presentations. My understanding of this evening is that we're going to have a little conversation here that quickly and hopefully richly becomes a conversation here, together in the room, and that will in turn carry that out to a reception and further conversation, and then an experience of Ai Weiwei's work, which is of course the occasion for us all to be here together. That's going to continue tomorrow, so I want to make a little plug for those of you who are super excited by the curatorial and institutional ideas you're beginning to hear, some of the theoretical, historical, and conceptual ways we might understand Ai Weiwei's work and our current time through Professor Yapp's presentation. I wanted to thank Signor Galansino and your team here at Strozzi. It's so exciting for us to be here, despite the jet lag and despite the kind of shifts of context and language, maybe even because of them, right? Which I think is part of what Ai Weiwei's work invites us to consider. And Luca and other folks who've made tonight possible. Also want to thank folks at Cinema Odeon, the team here that's opened up the space for us and made it possible for us to do our thing. Director Ellen Toscano, Lucia, everyone at campus and at the Villa who's made tonight possible, including Megan. I'm going to do a ridiculously inappropriate but first step of trying to make sense of what I heard and go through some of what we might call keywords. And I always find keywords both helpful, only insofar as they're ways in and maybe then ways back out, not insofar as them being dead ends or summaries. Does that make sense? The limit of a hashtag, but the possibility of it as well. So ambassador, activism, research, border, facade, I think so crucial and interesting. I just mentioned plural and common, what shapes us tomorrow. Improper, deep historicization, transnational moment, soft diplomacy. Each of these ideas, of course, worth whole conversations. What does it mean to unpack or untie, particularly if we've got mass and we've got repetition? What is the mass and repetition that we're together in this very room right now? What might we begin to unpack or untie together, to repack and to retie anew? Masking, plurality, what does it mean to be situated? You made a choice to come here, right? Maybe even to be together as opposed to other campuses or New York City where you'll be soon enough. What does it mean to be situated here? But lest we only have an NYU self-absorption, what would it mean to connect with our colleagues and our hosts, our neighbors, and perhaps our commons anew that we share? What does it mean to be racialized, right? Whose ideas, whose formations circulate and take center stage? What does it mean to think about these relationships in context and with plurality? Turning, dispossession, relations. So I'm going to take three of those ideas and hand them to my colleagues in this strange way that as an artist I like to work. You said something beautiful about your multiple hats, that you're a curator and you're a director, right? And you used a P word that I like quite a lot, which is peculiar. HENTYLE showed us this amazing piece that Ai Weiwei did in London and talked about the toxicity of the seeds. But at this slight toxicity, I'm interested in that in the formal and the methodological, but also maybe the conceptual. And then I want to hold that in relationship to the facade. So I used to think that facade meant fake. I had that understanding. And gently, one of my friends, we were driving to the beach one day, and he said, I don't think facade is a fake. I just think it's the front. It's the thing that's on front. So we had this debate about what is seen and unseen, what is real and fake. So I want to have us think through the peculiar, what is seen and maybe unseen, or what's behind what's seen, and then the slightly toxic, and maybe toxicity not only being a bad thing, but something that can purge or release. So I wonder if we could start with the peculiar, and what's been peculiar for you as a curator who's worked with the artist before, now working in this context, obviously bringing the show for certain reasons at this time in Europe and Italy's history, but also in your work with the artist. What's been peculiar about that process?
Thank you for the question. Everything has been said. It sounds very intelligent. I hope to be. I hope to be able, to reach this level. And first of all, congratulations to the NYU. This laboratory is great. Really, it's very to involve the students like that is incredible. So congratulations on what you are doing tonight. Yeah, peculiar. In many ways, is because. As you know, this is something even more peculiar, dear PATO, is that I am an old master art historian. My specialization is about Renaissance. I always been a curator of Renaissance shows such as Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, Mantegna, Leonardo, and recently Giorgione and Moroni. So my focus on, and before I published studies and books on art criticism and history of taste, so more theoretical studies, it's the first time in my life I work directly in contemporary art. As a curator, I mean, of course, contemporary and modern art have always been part of my interest. And in Italy, as you know, we are probably less specialized compared to an American student. I mean, we study probably less specialized, but more broad spectrum of art history. This is probably make us more flexible compared to other students, to other cultures. I really wanted to do this show, Pat, because I thought that the artist, this figure, this character, because as we have seen so far, that Ai Weiwei is not only an artist. This artist was perfect for what I wanted to do with Palazzo Strozzi. So the idea was to challenge, as you know, this facade that you quoted created a strong debate in Italy. We have never seen in Italy a debate like that so far. In art, I mean, in art, of course, we debate and we struggle and fight for many things, but not for art and not for contemporary art. And so I knew that Ai Weiwei would have been able to touch some bottom, some hidden bottom of our inner self, on our souls, maybe our fears, our unconscious thoughts, dream, and nightmare. And this is what happened, actually. This installation, very simple, is actually a kind of ready-made. It's not exactly ready-made because these both were done on purpose, and they were tailor-made on Palazzo Strozzi. Also about materials and toxicity, of course everything is fine. But yes, this ready-made, a very simple work was able to provoke and to pull out something of Florence culture, of Italian culture, and I think it was really revelatory.
Thank you for sharing that, and maybe you've already answered my question, Professor Yapp, through your presentation, so professional, delineated, but also pulsing with the layers, right? But I wonder if picking up on that, you could help us go deeper into your process and your engagement with the work. You talked about some of how Ai Weiwei's narrative as a person and an artist, but also the work itself can get trapped. But as you've been moving deeper into his work over the last several years, have you had some moments of the peculiar? You talked about repetition, you talked about mass. Are there other moments of the peculiar, which isn't to paint him as strange, but rather to move beyond the facades into what might be unique or interesting, or one of the terms you closed on, possible?
I guess for me, I'll throw out the word boredom, in the sense that I think what drove kind of my research agenda is the fact that I would read so much of the discourse on contemporary Chinese artists, and especially on Ai Weiwei, that I started to get bored, in the sense that I could literally map the narrative on every piece. And so I think that always becomes an interesting place to think through and to do research and to find some different avenues. And I think that then led me to less thinking about the depth of, to go into the import of the context and the history, which I learn and write a lot about, but then to also then do the fleeting surface, the facade of it. So that's a methodological question that I get a lot from feminist and queer theory, is rather than psychologize, is there a way to sort of take the reactions at the initial moment and engage, which is what people call affect theory, how you feel, how you relate, and it's much more what people call the surface readings. So I sort of want to bring that up because to bring to the other question around facade, I think we exist in kind of a moment of trying to find the authentic, like the real, what do you really like? And I think what's oftentimes important is this idea around seen and unseen, and you just mentioned that he becomes a figure, a character, that much of this is about discourse around performance and theatricality. And that one important thing to think about is that the unseen, or the scene and the immediate and the figure and the character, these are all ways that many people use to survive. Like sometimes I need to protect myself in order to not necessarily be fully accessible to everyone. That's a form of survival and protection, and that how to think and theorize in relationship to that behavior is a different way than simply trying to go in depth all the time. So that's also even like a larger methodological and theoretical preoccupation of mine is really comes from a very basic level of like as a former performer and as somebody who actually kind of loves surface, how can I sort of use that to then become a way to build a research agenda rather than thinking always about depth, because I feel like that's what we try to get in relationship to non-Western artists.
Yeah, I appreciate the response, and it reminds me again of my friend's provocation back to me, that I was assuming that front and first level of seeing was either fake or something blocking the real, right? As opposed to saying this curatorial strategy, this institutional strategy to activate with the artist the front of the building, minding toxicity so it doesn't damage this beautiful ancient architecture, produces, I think what you said, maybe the most kind of high-profile historic debate about this moment we're in. You said something else about knotting in your presentation, and knots, and you just mentioned survival. So knots, if for any of you who are boaters or climbers, crucial to survival, right? Literally linking us maybe to a way out, a way through. Knots as ways to strategically hide or subvert. Knots not only being a problem, the snarl of traffic or the knotting of traffic as you move closer to the city center here, right? Past the train station towards the palazzos. So I'm wondering if either of you could just play a little more with ideas of knots, either from the formal strategy of taking a space like this and then imagining how the work might live and knot or unknot through the space curatorially, right? And also how you play with ideas and this dance you're doing in and out of somebody's work, their history and context, but also the possibilities you're encountering therein.
I think that behind this installation, we are still talking about that, and the exhibition itself is much more than that. This is only, of course, the first thing that you can see. But behind this installation, there is, I think, a lot of thought, a lot of reflection about Renaissance, about the shape of the building itself. This installation, as the artworks in general, has many meanings, but only thinking about formally, thinking about the shape of what we have in front of our eyes, I think that is a very good interpretation and very deep thought about proportion, about perspective, about symmetry. In a way, Ai Weiwei is telling us that, that this shape of the window, this repetition can be like a repetition of an industrial object, such as a lifeboat, etc. So I think there is much more behind the first meaning of this installation. There is a subtle work of an artist, of I think very cultivated artist, as we were saying before. He was a great architect and is good in technique. What you can see in the exhibition, how this conceptual artist is actually very good, and he managed very elaborated and traditional technique that in China are disappearing. So, and I think you can see also these refined thoughts also behind this work.
I think I was referring, so for me, knots are things I just become obsessed with, right? And the things that I actually am not interested in undoing, but rather I'm interested in the process of always returning to the knot. But I also do want to sort of note the knots of institutional demands that I think you were talking about in relationship to the curation, to the debates around the work, that the knots of the different polls that you have from funders, from public demand, these are interesting questions for me to think about where we situate ourselves institutionally, and then what kind of work we do out of those knots, out of the institutional demands from many different sort of directions, which I really appreciated hearing about in relationship to the many hats that you're wearing, which is a very different situation of being both the director and curator. Like that's many, many knots and many different levels.
Can you, Henty, spin that a step further? And thanks for reminding us that knots aren't necessarily to be undone, right? And the risk I think I take both as an artist and a in this case, a moderator of a conversation, of putting something next to something that decontextualizes it in a way and it loses some of its power. But could you think about knots in relationship precisely to repetition and massing, the formal experience of that in Ai Weiwei's work, whether that's the sunflower seeds, whether it's the facade here, any number of pieces, bicycles, right, recontextualized on Diné land, right, in this collaboration he's doing with indigenous people back in what's known as the Southwest now of the US. This idea of knotting in relationship to the formal surface that you've talked about.
That's big.
We can just ride some Ai Weiwei bikes together.
I know, just bike. So I think you're pointing to a lot of different levels. So the first being the knots that he's creating in relationship to other communities and other people. And to not simply say we are, this isn't, it's a small world after all sort of knots. Like it's not this sort of Disney simplification that we're all in the same boat together, look how awful this is. But I really think he's saying like, there are certain populations that are knotted and stuck in dispossession and sheer dehumanization. And how can I do that? Like, how can I think through that? And so that, for me, I'm trying to identify the kind of knot he's trying to tie himself to these other, like, highly dispossessed, visibly dispossessed communities that we either don't talk about and acknowledge, especially thinking about Native American indigenous communities, especially within sort of U.S. American discourse and the academy, but also kind of the knots of the relationships that he's trying to sort of create, which for me is not so much about creating, it's not. And I think sort of with Ellen's sort of opening provocation, it's not about solving, it's not about presenting. He's not writing law, he's not funding. I mean, he does get some fund, obviously gets a lot of funding, but it's really this, how can we nuance this type of role of the relationship to the world? And I think he's presenting the not as a way to solve it, but as a way to present it as a problem. And I'm just most interested in the problems of life rather than the solutions.
I completely agree. I think one of the things that was not completely understood by our public, that art is often the problem or the question, not the solution. This, I think, is, we can say like that for almost every artist, all sort of art, and Ai Weiwei especially. We know, because we know the character, we know the figure, the public figure, what Ai Weiwei thinks, because he writes, because he talks. But this work is not saying that the solution of the problem is to welcome everybody, because we have been criticized by the right, the extreme right, also the neo-fascist and racist parties because of that, and also by other kind of opinions saying that this is a very easy way of thinking about this problem. But the thing that Ai Weiwei is doing is to say that Renaissance is Renaissance proportion, Renaissance structure are the roots of Europe, because are the roots of European culture. This problem, this filter, these both are filter in front of the windows, must be seen as something in front of our eyes, as a constant and repetitive issue that we have to front and to face. This is what Ai Weiwei is saying. Is not talking about migration policies. Yes, you are perfectly right. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's something too about in sort of remarking of the Italian Renaissance as this, there's certain question on this perspective. There's certain sort of traditional ways that come through that culture that within China, a reason I wanted to make sure to go over a quick, inappropriately quick overview of modern Chinese history is because he is stooped not simply in sort of US democratic discourse, but Chinese socialism. And Chinese socialism is a concept in terms of building a nation of how do you produce and unify a mass that's so disparate. And so it's also coming from a certain tradition that's deeply located and specific, but that then has some broader implications. So this idea around perspective can be located very specifically, but then how can you then abstract that and use that in a certain way formally? And I think there's something about the sort of tradition and lure and import of Chinese socialism for his work that is often underwritten, because they talk about his time in New York and it's about democracy, but there's something deep, a very deep commitment to socialist politics and leftist politics that he has that comes through in this question around mass and unification of mass and the disparateness of mass.
I want to transition quite soon here to what's on your mind, especially you're at the end of a day. It was a beautiful day. You've made your way down here to this space together. So my last question for my colleagues, which is then a question to all of us, and especially you in the room with us, is given what you both just said, can you just speak briefly to how we might then be invited or provoked or some other verb to take up a place in relation to the artwork? So as curator, you're definitely thinking about what's placed where, right? And literally, I imagine, maybe I'm assuming, the kinds of circulations and movements of bodies, i.e. audiences, i.e. us, people. And as you just said, the work is really thinking at certain levels about the possibility of a mass, and a mass that, yes, might be informed by dispossession, but not simply limited to that, or ideas produced somehow elsewhere against or on top of or subjected to us. So the question more simply put is, what does Ai Weiwei's work invite or provoke us to take up in terms of our position to one another and to the possibilities, to use that word again, of art?
This question, I think, is to be also related to our specific audience, because so we go again at the beginning of our discussion. Our audience, our Italian audience, is probably faced to the first time to an artist like Ai Weiwei, because of course he was guest at the Biennale twice, but this public is a specific public. Our public is a very general public, so this is the challenge of Palazzo Strozzi today, to make contemporary exhibition for a general public. So we have to explain very, very well, like in an historical exhibition. So you will see, this exhibition is built as an historical exhibition. There is a lot to read, a lot of information. It's very didactic. So first of all, there is a Palazzo Strozzi approach that it comes even before the Ai Weiwei approach. And of course, this approach wants to liberate the artist approach. This exhibition, you will see, is a big one, and it's like a lot of punches in the stomach, because we really choose the most iconic works of Ai Weiwei. And as you know, behind all these installations, performance, operation works, we can always find a big question, a big problem, a scandal, a tragedy. Actually, it's a very, I would say, heavy message that we communicate at the show. But this is, I think, is also the great thing about Ai Weiwei, that is able to communicate these heavy things, these tragedies, these things that make us think about society, progress, etc., in a very light way. And I think this is part of his success, and also part of all the criticism he receives.
I think this builds off well what I was going to say. Allow yourself to laugh. Allow yourself to take in the inappropriateness of some of his work. Allow yourself to get out of, I mean, we're routinized as publics, to bring that out again, to hold art as so precious. And then sometimes we'll like turn to a friend and shamefully say, I don't get it. Just come with that ethic, like, I don't get it, and talk to people. I think that's part of the production of the way he creates space, is to talk and to say and sort of point and laugh and to ask questions, because there's very deep humor. And it's not just irony, it's actual just plain old humor in many ways. So I think to come with that ethic of laughter and not being stuck in of a sort of preciousness around art is a really great way to engage his work.
And we want to find some great ways to engage you. My understanding is there's a little bit of refresh for our tired bodies outside, so we're going to get there in a second. But any questions or thoughts, invitations, provocations that you have, that you want to ask of our colleagues here? Rare opportunity to speak with the curator of a major show. Rare opportunity to speak with a dynamic scholar and artist who's looked closely at this work and danced with it in many ways. I'm buying you time to formulate your question.
I think somebody's bringing a microphone.
The marble surveillance camera, did he sculpt that himself, or does he have like a school, a bottega that makes the art and he just designs it?
As almost all the contemporary artists, Ai Weiwei has a bottega, a big bottega of hundreds of workers working in all the techniques. He does a project, he knows the material very well, so we can say that he masters these kind of techniques, but of course the porcelain, the marbles, and many other things are not done directly with his hands.
And just to bring in the discourse of, or the language of theater and performance, in many ways, I think he's functioning as a contemporary choreographer does, in the sense that there's a vision, then there's a whole team of people who heads just his architectural projects or just his visual projects. So it's a factory, but I think there's something about the language around directing and choreographing that is noting a different way in how artists are working now.
Yeah, and to connect both those comments to this context, how in some ways would the creation of Michelangelo's David, one of the great works to encounter here in Florence, be a both and, right? So not operating outside of a factory, or at least many, many hands, from the quarrying to the moving of the stone to the roughing out, even though there may have been a laying on of hands of the idea of the master artist, right? And that doesn't reflect aspects of Ai Weiwei's practice, which isn't to hold him to the Renaissance so much as to say, artists have often worked with this question of how present is our hand and how connected are we throughout the process, and what does it mean to work with others, that an artwork doesn't usually arise singularly or through a single entity, but it needs all these nodes, including curators and scholars, etc.
Yes.
So this is a retrospective show. What's been made specifically for this show versus a pre-existing artwork that was brought? How the new works came about?
Yeah, we started with the idea that Ai Weiwei is a Renaissance artist of 21st century. As we were just saying now, he directs a big workshop of hundreds and hundreds of workers for him. He's an artist, a visual artist, a sculptor, a draughtsman, a video maker, he's a singer, a performance. He was a cook as well.
He cuts hair.
Sorry?
He cuts hair as well.
Yeah, he cuts hair. He has a lot of cats. No, he really is a very various kind of intellectual and artist. So the first idea was to challenge him with Renaissance. I think Ai Weiwei is a kind of bridge figure, a bridge between East and West, because he used Western language. He learned this language in New York through the work of Andy Warhol and Duchamp. So he was influenced by the deepest Western language of art. But he used this language with Eastern techniques and materials. The wood, this kind of wood inlays and wood structures, porcelain, etc., etc. So we challenged the artists in trying to go further and also to incorporate our Western culture, the roots of the Western culture, as I said before, the Renaissance, our Renaissance roots in his art. And so what's happened that he created this installation for the facade, which is not only a political statement, but is also a reflection on Renaissance architecture. And then he created this series of portraits with Lego, done with the bricks, with the plastic bricks, inspired by the political dissidents. You mentioned the Alcatraz exhibition that you have seen. So this exhibition displayed 176 big portraits of political dissidents from all over the world, done with Lego, done with these bricks. But all these dissidents were they belong to the modern time, to 20th, 21st century. So what Ai Weiwei did was to include for the first time 4 historical figures of Florence in this theory of political dissidents, and they are very well-known characters: Dante Alighieri, Galileo Galilei, Savonarola, and the founder of our palace, Filippo Strozzi, who was exiled for many years because he was an enemy of the Medici. So, with this ironical touch, Ai Weiwei wanted to be part of our culture. I think is a nice step. Some could say that it's superficial, but I think again it was an important move in the career of the artist, because he's more and more looking outside of China, outside of this big ready-made, because what I always say that he made a ready-made using China itself.
This is just a question for all three of you guys. What's your favorite piece of work in the exhibit?
I'm going to put pressure on the curator, do you ever sort of have such a thing arise as a favorite, or does the work sort of look and reflect differently to you from concept to installation to then living with it once it's installed?
But I can tell you many options actually about my taste. In general, I think that tastes are not important when we do our job. There are many artists I don't like, but I think they are very, very important. And many artists I didn't like and I did exhibition on. So it's not a kind of perversion, but I think is normal. In my position, and I have to think about historical relevance more than what I like. This is in general. Then, if I had to choose, I'm very proud of these two special works that Ai Weiwei did for us, so the facade and this Renaissance room. I think they are great displays of art. They are not only works. I think they look very well in our space. In general, I appreciate the use of the space that we have done with Palazzo Strozzi, and also the use of the space I think is an artwork itself, is a part of the job, is part of the exhibition, because it's a really, say, functional use of this reinterpretation of this building. I think that this is, even if it is an invisible work, is probably the most beautiful work of the exhibition.
So I would also echo I don't really have play favorites, but then as parents do, that's a lie. There's always a favorite child. Kidding. They all love you. They love you equally. But some of the works that I really appreciate of his work are his photographs from his time in New York, where there's just photographs of really great big art figures from that moment. That's just really fun archivally. But there's also a great work that I think was just up of a raincoat cut with a hole for a condom. And much of that has to do with fears of toxicity, the HIV crisis. And that piece is just, I haven't seen it written about too much, and it's a piece that I'm really quite just interested in thinking about historically what it means for a Chinese artist to be in New York at the height of the HIV crisis and to think about issues around toxicity and fear and the body. So I think for me, that's like a piece that I've just always been I sit with a lot, and I have yet to really unpack, but that's a really interesting one for me.
Yeah, and similarly, I do have thumbs up and thumbs down, but they end up doing this a lot. And so, which isn't to dismiss the question, it's a really important question, but I do find myself coming back to the bikes and my own sort of, not narrow, but initial engagements with how he's worked with the bicycle and all the layering. So I do think that he's profoundly insightful and playful and subversive with ideas and works that arise from the West, so from Duchamp's use of the wheel. But he's also, as Dr. Yapp reminded us, bringing all kinds of other ideas that in some ways precede Western ideas, and so much that China has given to the world. And so the bike in contemporary Chinese culture for me is an interesting way to think through this, about movement, about massing, some of the ideas we've talked about today, about efficiencies, about factories, and then for all that, I'm just always struck by what's happening formally. So just as a sculpture, how are these linked together? What does it mean that they're both solid in some ways, but mainly through line, right, the frame or the wheel, but then into a kind of larger mass, but the mass is permeable. We can see through it. We might imagine we reach through it. It seems to be utilitarian. I made a joke earlier about us trying to ride around on this group bicycle structure that can't literally move, but it's moving us and our ideas. And it goes from ground up into the air. And so it's no longer simply a landlocked sculpture or installed experience, but becomes fully spatial. And when I've experienced them before, I have yet to experience it here tonight, so I'm looking forward to us making our shift. But it always activates the space in these really interesting ways. And so without reducing those works he does with bicycles to being the most demonstrative, those are some of the things that I'm always being pushed to keep rethinking what I think is happening in the work. And we're looking forward to meeting you right outside, and then getting tours from the docents and your team of the work. And we'd love to have breakfast with those of you who want to join us at 8:30, and Megan will be letting us know. We're going to hand off to Ellen, and then let's go be married together.
Okay, so just a quick reminder, for the NYU community, students, faculty, across the street to the Strozzi to see the exhibition, we have reserved the Palazzo Strozzi just for this community tonight, and so it's a pretty special occasion. And hopefully you will be intrigued enough to join PATO and HENTYLE for the workshop tomorrow morning. And now if you would join me in thanking our wonderful panel for a really interesting discussion.